Hi, everyone. It's David from Overthink, talking about William James on the Varieties of Religious Experiences. Although the whole book is a really interesting account of religious life that is constructed with a combination of psychological and philosophical analysis, as well as a lot of uh, testimonials from people who have had these kinds of experiences. There's a lot of quotes in the book, sometimes like 2 or 3 pages long, whereby James wants to give us a sense of how people describe these experiences in the first person. And so, although the book as a whole is very interesting and very accessible, there is one chapter that has had the most impact on subsequent psychological and philosophical work on religious experiences, and especially on mystical states. And that is the chapter entitled Mysticism. In this chapter, William James talks about mystical states, again, a broad category that includes really any kind of alteration of consciousness that people experience as mystical, and argues that all of these states have four fundamental characteristics that define them. Those characteristics, which I'll be talking about in this video, are ineffability, noetic quality, transiency, and passivity. So let's jump into these various characteristics and talk about what they mean for James. So to begin with, when somebody has mystical experience, something that deviates from our typical way of experiencing the world, one of the most important qualities or characteristics of that experience is that it will typically resist what in contemporary philosophy of consciousness is called reportability. We can talk about the fact that we had the experience. We can talk maybe about what the experience has meant to us, but it's very difficult to describe the experience itself, because the experience, being mystical, being transcendent in some way, will tend to put pressure on our concepts and on their suitability to capture such an intense experience. So think about somebody who has a conversion experience and who suddenly wakes up one day and decides that they want to be Catholic. Well, that experience, that moment of intense, affectively charged coming to a new truth, it's very difficult to capture in the relatively static words of any natural language. It seems like any description that you give of the experience will not really do justice to the experience. And that's not because of a limitation in the linguistic abilities of the person who's giving the description. It's just a structural feature of these experiences, which is that they are not suitable for linguistic capture. They're not poised for linguistic exhaustion. And so there's just something about them that is fundamentally ineffable. It's beyond language, and it's precisely because it's beyond language that we experience them as pulling us out of ourselves, and as resisting our ability to want to share with other people. And this is why William James says that any mystical state of mind, is always going to be closer to a state of feeling than to a state of intellect. Because, of course, an intellectual state is something that you can talk about, it's something that you can explain, and it's something that you can even potentially teach to somebody, right? So think about an intellectual mental state, like when I think 2 + 2 is 4. Well, that's a mathematical truth that I can talk about, I can explain, and I can convey to another person. But my mystical experience is something that cannot be captured by language in the same way. So that's the first one. The second characteristic that James talks about is what he calls the noetic quality of a mystical state. And the term noetic here, you can think about it as a combination of illumination and authority. And what James means when he says that mystical states have a noetic quality about them is that these states illuminate the world in a new way for us. They lead us to see the world quite literally through new eyes. And this new perspective has what he calls a certain weight that we cannot deny. And so there is illumination in the sense of making us see things that maybe we didn't see before, but also it has authority in the sense that you can't really deny the significance that this experience has had on you. And I think anybody who has had mystical experience or a religious conversion, which would be an example of a mystical state, will agree that when you have these experiences that are very difficult to describe using the concepts of natural language, you're not just describing an experience that happened to you that is just like any other experience. You're talking about an experience that stands out precisely because it expresses a certain truth, perhaps, or it reveals something to you. It illuminates the world or your life in such a way that you cannot deny um, the weight and the significance and the gravitas of what has been revealed to you. Now, the third category that James talks about is transiency. And this is by far the simplest one because it's simply a temporal criterion. And it just means that these mystical experiences typically cannot be sustained for a very long period of time. They might last seconds, they might last a couple of hours, but rarely, James says, do they last more than a couple of hours. So we're talking about something that happens suddenly and that disappears after a few minutes or hours. And that means that once you have a religious experience, it is defined by its singularity. It is not recreated in the same way. So, for example, I can watch a painting and then come back and see it a second time. Surely, the second time that I see the painting at the museum will be influenced by the first time that I had already seen it. But in general, we can talk about them as being, in the grand scheme of things, replicas of the experience. I'm seeing the same thing over and over again. And that's why, I might not want to go to a museum to see the same exhibition for the sixth time or the seventh time, because at some point I've been there and I've done that. But with mystical states, there is a radical singularity to them, which means that they cannot be reproduced in experience. And James adds, they cannot be reproduced in memory either. So, in the same way that they resist capture through the net of our linguistic categories, these experiences also don't respond very well to acts of subjective recall, right? If I try to remember what the experience was like and to sort of recreate it in my body through an act of recollection, I will fail just as miserably as I fail when I try to talk about what the experience was like to a person who didn't live it. And so the transiency refers to those two things together, that it doesn't last a long time, and that because of that, it is also unreproducible. It cannot be recreated very easily, either in experience or in memory. Now, the fourth category that we have to talk about is passivity. According to James, when we undergo a religious experience or a mystical state, we undergo it in the sense that it takes charge of our subjective experience and pulls the cords even against our will. So it's almost as if the center of agency is transferred from the person who is having the experience to the state of mind or to the experience itself. Like the experience is happening and I'm just along for the ride and I don't even have the right to opt out. So there is a notion of passivity, there is a notion of surrender that I talked about in a previous video, and there's a sense in which we kneel down before the experience rather than control it or make decisions about it. And William James says that for this reason, religious experiences and mystical states are very similar to things like prophetic speech. When somebody suddenly goes into a mode of speaking truth like divination, think about like an ancient oracle, Or also, he uses the example of a mediumistic trance when, in the 19th century has been called the century of media, or of mediums in the plural, because there were all these people who would try to act as mediums between this world and the other world. And when a medium is trying to make a connection, they make a connection, and it's almost as if the people from the other side are speaking through them rather than they speaking on their own terms and on their own accord. He also uses the example of I'm sorry, not automated, automatic, although it is automated also, automatic writing. When you start writing automatically in such a way that the behavior bypasses the centers for subjective control, which was also a very common practice in the late 19th, early 20th century, as a way of trying to produce works that were beyond reason, when you try to just reach that state, that flow state of writing automatically, even without thinking about it. And so in prophetic speech, in automatic writing, and in these mediumistic trances, we see a kind of passivity where the subject surrenders to something that is greater than them and that is not of their own making. And that's what happens in every single mystical state or mystical experience, independently of what kind of experience it is. And this brings me to the last point that I want to make here, which is that although William James is primarily interested in religious experiences, maybe in the traditional sense of people suddenly seeing the cosmos or the universe in a particular way, sensing the presence of a divine, or of a god, or of a deity of some sorts, or multiple deities, he does recognize, especially in the chapter on mysticism, which I mentioned is arguably the most important one in the book, at least in terms of its legacy. He does recognize that there's a very wide range of experiences that can qualify as the mystical experiences by his definition. He talks about scenes of natural beauty. When you see, for example, a waterfall, or you see a meadow and you are entranced by its beauty. He talks about music, when you hear a beautiful melody and it just takes you over and it takes you out of yourself. There is a kind of mysticism there that is hard to deny. There's an ineffability, there's a noetic quality, there's a transiency, and there's a passivity that meet those four conditions for mysticism. He talks also about the experience of déjà vu. When you see something, you're like, I think I've seen this before, but I don't know how that could possibly be true because I've never been here. And he also talks about cases of pathology, various psychiatric conditions, or neurological conditions where there is a dissolution of the self. He says in those moments, people can have a mystical experience, or rather experience the dissolution of the self as itself being mystical. That is a mystical experience. He also talks about substances like anesthetics, intoxicants. He talks about mind-altering substances like nitrous oxide. And he himself experimented with nitrous oxide and had a kind of mystical experience through the alteration of his own consciousness. And the point about substances here, I think, is also relevant in terms of thinking about the place that James occupies in contemporary philosophical discourse, because in recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in psychedelics and other mind-altering substances. So think about psilocybin mushrooms, think about LSD, think about mescaline, think about MDMA. And the people who are working on these questions about what these drugs do to the mind and how they alter our conscious self, many of them are going back to thinkers from the early 20th century, people like Bergson, people like Whitehead, definitely people like James, to try to recover some resources that were already there in the history of philosophy and psychology that might help us think about these new problems that we are now considering. And so right now there is a resurgence of interest in the writings of William James, precisely because of this renaissance of interest in the philosophy of intoxication and mind alteration. Now, let me conclude here by saying that according to James, all these experiences, whether it is watching a beautiful meadow, listening to a beautiful melody, or doing nitrous oxide or some other substance, what it does is that it alters the landscape of conscious experience and it opens us up to new possibilities. And he says that these experiences, mystical experiences, ultimately give us new hypotheses of what reality is that break us out of our habitual ways of thinking about the real. And so they put new possibilities on the table for us to consider, including possibilities that we would have never even considered to be viable candidates for discussion before we actually had the experience. And there's a passage at the very end of the book that I really like, where he says all of these experiences, they open us up to the possibility of other orders of truth. And I'll leave you with that.